Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on Identifying Birds on the Farm by Olivia Smith of Washington State University. I'm your host, Alice Formiga of eOrganic. eOrganic has many articles, videos, and webinars about organic farming and research, and you can find all of them by typing webinars by eOrganic into a search engine, and you can also find the recordings on the eOrganic YouTube channel. We will be recording this webinar, and we will have the recording available on YouTube within 1 to 2 weeks. The webinar will last approximately an hour, and when it's over, we'll have 30 minutes for your questions. If you have a question, feel free to type it into the Q&A box on your webinar control panel at any time. If you don't see the Q&A box, there should be a black bar with some controls at the bottom of your screen, and if you click on the Q&A one, that should pull it up. I have also put the link to a PDF handout of the slides for this webinar in the chat box, so you can look at that later for help identifying birds. So I'd like to welcome back the presenter of today's webinar, Olivia Smith. Olivia is a PhD candidate at Washington State University, and her research is on the role of wild birds in organic agriculture. Her work focuses on how farm management and the habitat around a farm shapes the functional role of the bird community. So welcome, Olivia, and I'm going to hand over the remote control to you.
Okay, thanks, Alice. So an overview for the webinar today, we'll mostly be focusing on bird identification, and I've chosen 43 of the most common farm bird species, which was hard to choose, but I tried to pick species that are common throughout at least a large portion of the country. And there are some management tips sprinkled throughout, and this says 10-minute Q&A, but it'll be actually 30 minutes. Oops. Okay, it's working now. So tips for identifying birds. The first question to ask yourself is, should this species be in my part of the country during this time of year? Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which is the best place to get bird information in general, has 4 keys to bird ID, which they say are size and shape. So that includes things like the beak shape, the wing shape, and the tail shape. The color pattern, which includes the color itself, as well as things like streaking and spotting patterns. The behavior of the bird, such as the way that they look while they're flying, if they're high up in the forest or if they're down on the ground. A lot of species do a tail bobbing behavior if it's in a group or if it's by itself. And the habitat that you find the bird in, some species like house sparrows are usually in urban environments, whereas some species like Pacific slope flycatcher would basically only be found in forest habitat. And then finally, songs and call are a really useful tool for identifying birds so that you don't have to actually find them. And some species are really difficult to tell apart unless you have that sound and call cue. So today we'll mostly be focusing on identification through color pattern. And then as you begin to spend more time identifying birds, you can kind of pick up the rest as you go. When managing birds, it's important to remember that native species are protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So unless you get a pest permit, you can't harm the birds themselves or their nests. And invasive species, on the other hand, you can control through lethal means, and we'll talk about identifying the invasives versus similar natives later on in the webinar. And in general, if you want to try to attract birds, providing appropriate food sources, a nesting space that's safe from predation, and suitable habitat are all good ways to attract birds. If you want to try to discourage birds, there are some mechanisms, and if you have some that aren't listed that you'd like to share, you can go ahead and type them into Q&A and we can read them off later. And I think in general with deterrence mechanisms, it's important to say that most of these aren't tested by scientists, so I can't really say if some are really effective or not, but some general ones are, of course, netting off trees, putting netting on structures to prevent nesting, using something like a noisemaker or a laser beam, mylar reflective tape like in this photo, removing habitat near crops that you don't want damaged, using loud noises, predator decoys, or promoting raptors, which raptors will be our final group of the day, and we'll talk a little bit about using raptors for pest control. And of course, for invasives, you can use lethal control, and it's always recommended to use more than one technique, and that way you can target different birds and help to avoid them getting acclimated to the deterrence mechanism. So we'll jump into the bird identification, and we'll start with hummingbirds. And there are many hummingbird species in the country, so I've chosen 3 that are the most common along the West Coast and east. The first one is the Anna's hummingbird, which is distributed along the West Coast and very common on farms. The male and the female are what's called sexually dimorphic, which means that they don't look the same. With birds, many species are dimorphic with 2 forms, and some are monomorphic where they have 1 form. And of course, the dimorphic birds are a little bit trickier to tell apart. So throughout the presentation, I'll point out features that are kind of good cues to look for when you're trying to identify a bird. For the Anna's hummingbird male, his most defining feature is his beautiful iridescent red throat. He has a greenish body and his tail extends down past his wings. She's a bit more difficult to tell. She has some throat spotting but lacks the beautiful iridescent throat. She's greenish and gray below. A really good way to tell hummingbirds apart is by their sound. So we'll listen to a few sound clips throughout the presentation, but mostly do visual ID. The Anna's hummingbird has a really metallic-y, scratchy song that's very simple. So hopefully this works. So in contrast to his beautiful plumage, it's not a very pleasant sound, but when hummingbirds are flying quickly past you, sound can be a really good way to identify them. So next is the Rufous Hummingbird, which overlaps in a large portion of its range with the Annas. The male and female are also dimorphic. Like the name implies, he has a rufous body and a red throat with his tail extending down past his wings, whereas she's a lot more plain looking. She has some rusty flanks, a greenish body, she has some throat spotting, and she has some rufous in her tail. So she's kind of got a rufous tinge, but otherwise she's fairly similar to the Annas. In contrast to the Annas, the Rufous has a pretty defined song pattern. It's not as scratchy. Oops. Their song isn't popping up. Alice, do you have any luck with trying to get it?
Yeah, let me try it.
There's a red-winged blackbird at the end of that recording. So it's just more patterned of a zoo, zuppity, zup, zup. So if there's kind of more of a patterning, it's likely a Rufous. And once you get to be an expert birder, the buzz of the wings of a hummingbird is a good identification tool. So if it's a really high-pitched buzz or a low-pitched buzz, if they're just whipping past you, you can identify them that way. So if you're on the East Coast, it'll be easier to identify a hummingbird because the only breeding species is the ruby-throated. And with the male, like his name implies, he has a beautiful red throat and a dusky body, whereas the female, like the other hummingbird females, is just more drab. She has a white belly and breast with some light throat spotting and some buffy flanks. But if you're in the East or Midwest, chances are this is what you're seeing. Hummingbirds have been estimated to pollinate 3 to 5% of crops globally, and most of this information comes from the tropics, but it's quite likely that they're also pretty beneficial in your fields. And if you want to try to attract hummingbirds into the field to try to harness some of the pollination services, planting flowers in the same way that you would for pollinators interspersed throughout the crops that are flowering throughout the season is a good way to do that. And usually when I see hummingbirds in fields, they're coming into larger flowers, like what you would sell for decorative flowers. And if you want to try to attract them to your house, Cornell recommends a 1/4 cup table sugar to 1 cup of water. And make sure to disinfect the feeder every couple weeks to prevent buildup of fungus and bacteria. Next are chickadees and warblers, which we'll just talk about 2 chickadees and 1 warbler for the sake of time. Though, of course, there are many beautiful warblers that you can find throughout the country. The first chickadee is the black-capped chickadee, which is distributed out throughout the northern part of the country. He has a black cap, like his name implies, white cheeks, a very small insectivorous bill, a black throat, and buffy flanks. The Carolina chickadee is in the southeastern portion of the country, and they look almost essentially the same. So if you happen to be in this overlap region in the Ohio, Tennessee type area, you'll oftentimes be able to have both of them in the same location, and because they look so similar, the best way to tell them apart is by their song. And chickadees have over a dozen vocalizations, but there are a few that are kind of their most defining sounds to listen for. Their song differs. The black-capped chickadee is said to have a 2 to 3 note phoebe, so it'll be phoebe, as opposed to the Carolina chickadee has 4 notes and goes phoebe, where notes 1 and 3 are higher. And they both have a chickadee call, like their name implies. And so hopefully this one will play too. So this one is the black-capped. So it's the repetitive chickadee note. And then here is the Carolina, which is faster than the black-capped. Alice, it's not coming up. Could you get this one again, please? So it's a bit faster, and the length of the D actually isn't what varies between species, but the length of the D indicates the degree of threat that the chickadee faces. So it's a signal to other chickadees and other species. The more Ds they have, the more predation threat there is. So if there's a hawk, there'll be a lot of Ds, as opposed to if a person is walking by, there might be fewer Ds. So in general, with managing chickadees, they're cavity nesters, so providing that nesting habitat can be a good way to get them to reproduce and be on the property. Here's a photo of a northern flicker fledgling, but the same management tip would apply, where if you can leave up dead trees, that provides a natural cavity nesting space for them. Or if you want to provide nest boxes, that's a really good way to attract them, and just monitor them to make sure that the native species are using them rather than the invasives. And chickadees are an arboreal species. They prefer to be in trees. So if you want to try to get them into your crops to help with insect control, a good way is to have those crops near a hedge or a forest so that they can reach them. In general, insectivorous birds' services have been shown to be most effective when the crops are closer to the natural habitat. And chickadees are insectivorous. It's been estimated that one brood of chickadees can eat over 5,000 caterpillars, so they can be very beneficial for caterpillar control in the orchards. But I think it is important to say that at the end of the season, they can eat fruit. So any bird species are gonna have a really high insect component in the diet when they have chicks, and the chicks need that insect protein to grow. But as the season progresses and more fruits are available, almost any bird species will switch over to eating fruits, except for the swallows, which we'll talk about swallows. It might be our next group, actually, after the warbler. So the only warbler we're talking about today is the common yellowthroat. There are many warblers throughout the country, but typically they're not as common in farm habitat. So for the sake of time, we'll just talk about common yellowthroat, who is distributed throughout the country. And common yellowthroats are pretty common in things like brassicas, anything that's kind of low to the ground. They're definitely a understory ground foraging species. The male is distinguished by his yellow throat, as the name implies, and he has a black mask. And common yellowthroats are highly insectivorous. They also eat a lot of caterpillars, so they have a pretty long beak that they can grab insects with. And the yellowthroat has a pretty long tail. The female lacks the black mask. She's just kind of brownish above. And her yellow extends down past her throat onto the breast. They also have a really pleasant song, which I didn't put a recording on. They're said to say, witchity witch, witchity witch. So it's a pretty easy one to identify, and it's something kind of fun to listen for in the fields. So next, I've labeled these as fruit eaters, which of course, most birds will eat fruit at some part of the season. Some birds will eat more fruit than others. The first one is the Bullock's Oriole. who is in the western part of the country. And the male and female are also dimorphic. He has a black eye stripe, and orioles are actually in the same group of birds as the native blackbirds, such as red-winged blackbirds. And so they have the sharp pointed bill that's characteristic of most of the native blackbirds. And he is orange throughout his body with a large white wing patch. And wing patches are a really good cue to look for across bird species. If they have a strong wing patch or not, can be a really good identification tip. And she's a bit more difficult to identify. She has a white wing bar, a white belly, orange yellow tail, and orange yellow throat and head. And sound can be a good way to find Bullock's Orioles because they're oftentimes in trees and kind of hard to find. The Baltimore Oriole is in the eastern part of the country, and the Baltimore and Bullock's Oriole used to be considered the same species. That was called the Northern Oriole. So you might remember there being a Northern Oriole, but you're not familiar with these, but it used to be the same species, considered the same species. The male looks fairly similar to Bullock's, except for his black is all over his head, neck, and back. So he doesn't have the black stripe with the orange in his face. He's just all black. Again, they have that pretty sturdy blackbird beak. And she's also pretty difficult to tell from other species like tanagers, but the beak shape is a good cue. And she has 2 white wing bars and is otherwise pretty brownish yellow. If you want to attract orioles, a good way to do that is to place out orange slices, a half water, half grape jelly mixture in a shallow dish, or purchasing an oriole nectar feeder. And orioles do eat a lot of fruits, unfortunately. They eat mostly insects in the beginning of the season, so you can maybe try to harness those insect services and then net off trees would be one recommendation. And when they eat fruits, they use a method called gaping, where they stick their beak into the fruit and then open their beak and lick out the juices. And so you'll just get holes in the fruits. And they have pretty cool nests. This is a picture of one that is almost completed on a farm in California. And this nest is near their sheep enclosure. And so you can see that they've picked up twine and wool to build their nest, which is a pendulum that hangs onto the tree and just has an opening in the front. Next are the Cedar Waxwings, which they're distributed throughout the northern part of the country during the summer and then migrate south during the winter. And like their name implies, they actually have wax on their wings, which is what creates that beautiful red tip color. And they have a yellow tail tip. They have a crest, which crests are a really good cue to look for in birds too, and a black mask. And there's also a Bohemian waxwing, which you can find in the northern part of the country during the winter. And the main difference between cedar and Bohemian is that cedar have a white color under their tail and Bohemian have a rufous color. So our final, what I've labeled as fruit eater, is the American robin, which I think most people can identify. And what you might not be able to identify is the juvenile, which robins are actually in the thrush family along with birds like the Swainson's thrush or wood thrush. And the juvenile really looks like a thrush. You can see that they are thrushes when they're in the juvenile form. They have breast spots and they have the streaking that goes from the beak onto the throat. And they're starting to get those orange sides. And American robins are also often in large groups. So a good way to identify the juvenile is through the proximity to the adult. Next are swallows, which I think are probably one of the most beneficial groups and one that farmers most want to attract in addition to the raptors, which will be our last group. So I've divided up the swallows into 2 groups, the mud nesting swallows and the cavity nesting swallows, and these 2 groups have different management recommendations. The first mud nesting swallow is the barn swallow, which is a globally distributed swallow, and they're migratory down into the tropics in the winter because they're obligate insectivores, meaning that the only thing that they eat is insects, or I should say arthropods, because they'll also eat other non-insect arthropods. And the barn swallow's most defining feature is his tail streamers, which the other swallows lack the tail streamers. So if you see tail streamers in flight, then chances are it's the barn swallow that you're seeing. And the tail streamers stabilize the swallows while they're in flight, which is how they're so much more aerodynamic and can do really beautiful flips and twists and turns compared to the other swallows. And they also fly really low to the ground, right at the crop level. The foraging height of swallows is a really good way to identify them. The barn swallow gets right along the ground, whereas the other ones are typically higher up. He also has a bluish cap and a rufous throat. And their nests are mud nests that they build on the side of structures, usually barns, like the name implies. And their nests are open cup, and they build it with both grasses and mud. The next swallow is cliff swallow, which looks pretty similar. The easiest way to tell them apart is the lack of tail streamers in the cliff swallow and the white forehead. And the cliff swallow generally forages at a higher altitude. And the nest, unlike the barn swallow, has a closed top, and they don't use any grasses in the nest. It's only mud. So I'm sure that many of you that have barn swallows know that barn swallows tend to be a bit messy. So the general recommendation is to try to net off eaves where you don't want them nesting, such as where you're trying to pack up your food. And you can place wooden ledges where you do want nesting. Cornell's Lab of Ornithology's website, nestwatch.org, has information on promoting nesting in most species you can think of in North America. So here's a link to the barn swallow in particular if you want more help with figuring out how to build those ledges so that you can attract them and get those insectivorous services while preventing them from dirtying areas that you don't want them to. Next are the cavity nesters, which are easier because you can put the cavity wherever you want it. The first one is the tree swallow, who's distributed throughout the northern part of the country. They have a blue top and a white belly. Next is violet green, which looks pretty similar, except they're only on the western part of the country. They have this green-purple fade on top rather than being pure blue, and also have that white belly. So if you're in the portion of the country where these two species overlap, a good way to identify them from each other, if you get a good look, if the white extends up above the eye onto the eyebrow, then it's a violet green. The tree swallow's blue extends below the eye. There's also on the violet green, like the name implies, it fades from violet to green. But if you're looking up at active foraging swallows, it can be pretty difficult to see that color gradient. So if you look for its rump, the white extends further up on the violet green swallow, and the song is a good way to tell them apart as well. Next are bluebirds, which are farmers' friends. The first is the western bluebird, who's distributed, like his name implies, throughout the West. The male is a lot bolder than the juvenile and female. He has a beautiful blue wings, tail, head, and throat, and a rust orange vest. So this orange color extends around the breast, up onto the shoulders and back. The juvenile is just kind of more washed. The orange isn't so bright. It has blue tints rather than being solid blue. And like this picture indicates, they eat a lot of invertebrates. So they can be really good at pest control. There have been a few studies looking at pest control services of western bluebirds, and they found that they can reduce pest infestations up to almost 5 times in the immediate vicinity of the nest box. Next is eastern bluebird, which of course is distributed throughout the East. The difference between the male and juvenile and female is similar, where the male has the nice blue wings, tail, head, and throat. And then wings, tail, and head. And then the rust orange extends on the breast, sides, and throat, and has the white belly, whereas the juvenile is just kind of more pale washed. There is a portion of the country where the ranges overlap. The western bluebird has been expanding its range eastward over the last few decades. So if you're in this portion of the country, the easiest way to tell them apart is that on the eastern bluebird, the rufous doesn't extend as far back, and on the western, he has a blue throat, whereas the eastern has a rust orange throat. Like I said, bluebirds are extremely good at pest control, and we've published an article on eOrganic if you want to read more about western bluebirds. And if you want to try to attract them, providing nest boxes near the crops that you want their help with is a really good way to do that. And Cornell has a nest box plan available for them as well. Next are the finches. The first one is the house finch. They are native to the western, southwestern portion of North America, and they were introduced onto Long Islands decades ago, where they've since expanded their range. The male and the female are dimorphic. A couple good finch tips. First of all, the beak shape is pretty thick. Finches have high portions of grain in their diet, and so they have a nice big grain cracking beak. Finches also have notched tails that you can look for. And the house finch, male, has a rosy red face and upper breast with brown streaking on the side. The female and juvenile lack the red color. They're just kind of blurry streaking, but you can often find them. They're highly gregarious, so you'll find them together. And the house finch male's color can be a more yellow color if they have a poor diet, and then a red color if they have a good diet. The purple finch is pretty similar looking. They won't be in a large portion of the range during the summer. In the winter, they'll migrate down and perhaps be a little bit more difficult to tell apart. The male and the female, again, are dimorphic. They have that really thick seed-eating bill characteristic of the finches. He has a raspberry head, breast, and back, whereas she's just kind of coarsely streaked. And she does have a pretty defined white eyebrow and cheek stripe that's a good cue to look for. If you're trying to tell them apart, if you're in a part of their range in the right time of season that they would co-occur, a good way to tell them apart is that the purple finch's color extends down onto his back, whereas on the house finch, that red color doesn't extend onto the back. And on the flank, the house has brown streaking, whereas the purple has the raspberry streaking that goes down. And there's also some variation in song that's a good cue. Next is the American goldfinch, which is generally a welcome visitor to bird feeders. And so I'm just presenting the breeding plumage, though there's also the non-breeding plumage that makes it a little bit more difficult. So with the American goldfinch male, he has a black cap, yellow back, neck, breast, and belly. He has a really defined white wing bar and some clear white wing markings. And they have a thick seed-eating bill, though it's not as thick as the house and purple finch. So she lacks that defined black cap, and she has more of an olive back compared to the bold yellow back on the American. Next is lesser goldfinch, which is found in the southwest portion of the country. And to make it a little bit more confusing, the lesser goldfinch has two primary color variations for males, in addition to the female plumage, with the western green-backed in the western part of the country, and then the black-backed in the eastern portion of the range and Central America. They have, again, the thick seed-eating finch bill and the white wing patch. And on the black-backed, of course, he has a black-backed, and on the green-backed, he has a gray cheek, kind of splitting up the black cap and the black on the back. And she's just more olive colored than he is. So if you're in the portion of the country in the right time of year for them to overlap, the best way to tell them apart is that the American has the yellow that extends down his back, whereas the lesser has that black on his back. And the song is another good way to tell them apart. The American has a harsher and faster song to listen for. And in general, with attracting the finches, providing feeders is a really good way to do that. Keeping those feeders clean is important. Disinfecting every couple weeks can help prevent the finches from getting sick. They can get salmonella, which is very toxic to them. They'll often have mass mortalities if that gets transmitted at the feeder, as well as things like avian conjunctivitis. So providing food is great. Make sure that you keep the feeders clean. So next are the North American sparrows, which people often refer to as little brown jobs as a joke because they're very hard to tell apart from each other. The first one is song sparrow, and they're distributed throughout the country, and they have a lot of plumage variation. There are actually over 50 subspecies of song sparrows, but there are some features that are pretty consistent across the subspecies. The first one is that they have a breast spot. So looking for a breast spot, presence or absence, is a really good first step to sparrow identification. Their beaks are a bit thinner than finches. They have higher proportion of insects in their diet. And sparrows also are usually on the ground or in brush, whereas things like finches tend to be more in trees. So the height that you find the bird is a really good cue. This song sparrow has the russet stripes on the crown and eye and a white belly. And song sparrow and sparrows in general have very beautiful songs that are good ways to tell them apart. So here's a clip of the song. And there will be a lot of variation throughout the range. The North American sparrows are what are called open-ended song learners, which means that they learn their songs from other birds, as opposed to things like flycatchers that have fixed songs where they don't learn the song from other birds, they're born knowing that song. And if birds can learn songs from other birds in the area, that makes it so that they can acquire what are called local dialects, and so you get very distinctive local song patterns. Next is the white-crowned sparrow. And I've heard a lot of complaints from growers in California about migrating white-crowned sparrows, that as they're migrating up through, oftentimes they'll just decimate a field of lettuce starts. They do eat a lot of insects during the chick rearing period of the season. So they're a good example of a bird that can be beneficial in one part of the season and harmful in another. Identifying the white-crowned sparrow, the most defining feature is, of course, his white crown and white eyebrows, and he has a plain white breast, so he doesn't have streaking like some of the other sparrows. And he doesn't have a white throat. The white-throated sparrow is similar, except for it has, of course, a white throat. Next is Savannah Sparrow, which is a grassland nesting sparrow. Their most defining features are that they have a yellow eye stripe, a streaked breast, and a white belly. And their color is more buffy because they're grassland. Their plumage more matches grass as opposed to some of these other shrubby sparrows that are a little bit darker. And they have a really pretty song. It's so that they say, "Sit, sit, sit, it's breezy." So that's something good to listen for in pastures. Next is dark-eyed junco, which they also have a lot of subspecies. There are over 20 subspecies. And as you can see in these pictures, these subspecies tend to look very different, so it can be a bit difficult to figure out what you're looking at. But the feature that is consistent throughout the subspecies is that they have white outer tail feathers. And these are pretty easy to see when they fly up. So oftentimes they'll be in groups, and then when they fly, you can see their white outer tail feathers. Next is eastern towhee, which towhees are part of the North American sparrow family. Eastern towhee is in the eastern portion of the country, and it used to be considered the same species as the spotted towhee, which was called the rufous-sided towhee. So you might remember there being a rufous-sided towhee. That species has been split into eastern and spotted. The male and female are slightly dimorphic. There's not too much variation. The main difference is that he has the black top and she and the juveniles have the brown top. And they both have reddish eyes with seed-eating bills, although of course in this picture you can see they also eat insects, and a white belly, the rufous sides, and white on the outer tail corners. The spotted towhee is found in the western portion of the country. And like the name implies, they have the white wing spots and otherwise look pretty similar to eastern. In general, sparrows are pretty omnivorous, where they'll help with insect control, they will eat your transplants, and they will eat fruits. And they also, during migration in particular, will eat a lot of weed seeds. This photo is of a Savannah sparrow that was eating a lot of weed seeds in this field. If you want to try to promote sparrows or discourage them, managing brush is a good way to do that. If you want to try to attract them to the fields, planting and retaining brush near the crops can help them reach the crop fields. And the weedier the field, generally, the more sparrows you're going to get. So removing weeds can be a good way to try to keep them out of the fields, or leaving some weeds can help feed them. And there are some, like the Savannah and grasshopper sparrows, and if you're in the central part of the country, many more sparrows that nest in grasses. So leaving some grassland or pasture can help promote Savannah or grasshopper sparrows. In general, when trying to promote grassland birds, they're going to have the highest nest success if that grassy area is undisturbed. So if you can afford to leave some grass as a bird designated area, that's going to be the most beneficial to them. It's generally recommended to mow no sooner than around July 15th. And some areas for the Conservation Reserve Program are starting to increase that into August. I used to work with northern bobwhites, and we would still find nests in the Conservation Reserve Program grasses as late as October. So they will nest throughout the season, and the longer you can wait, the higher chance they have of being able to successfully raise offspring. Next are the North American blackbirds. The first one is red-winged blackbird. He's pretty easy to identify. He has a red shoulder and is otherwise black. She's a bit more difficult to identify. So they both have the blackbird beak that's pretty long and thin, and you'll often find them together is another good cue. She's slightly smaller, and she's very cryptic so that she can hide from predators while she's nesting in grasses. She has a yellowish face wash and some brown streaking with some stripes on the face. And also they have a very characteristic song. The brown-headed cowbird is next, which is a pretty interesting species. They historically were in the Great Plains, where they would roam with the bison and follow them around and eat the insects off of them. When Europeans colonized North America, they were able to expand their range and use the human habitat, where now they're often found in proximity to livestock, where they can help with insect control on the livestock by eating flies, but of course they also will love to eat the grain. And the brown-headed cowbird, like the name implies, the male has a brown head and a pretty black body. They have thick beaks that enable them to eat that grain. She's pretty plain brown with few markings, and the juveniles have a scaly appearance. And the juveniles are kind of interesting. This species is what is called a nest parasite, which means that they lay their eggs in the nests of other birds. And this allowed them to continue to follow the large mammal herds to forage, while another bird would take care of their offspring. And this is also often considered a conservation problem. People have found that the rates of nest parasitism are often highest on the edge of forests, so fragmentation is one of the factors that leads to higher nest parasitism rates. And I've also seen brown-headed cowbirds eat flea beetles, so that's the good news. Next is common grackle, which is in the eastern part of the country. They are a fairly large blackbird, up to around 12 inches. They both have a pretty bright yellow eye that contrasts with the iridescent head and brown body. And she's generally less glossy, but they both have this really long tail and they're both very large. Next is Brewer's blackbird, which is in the western part of the country. And this is another one of the few species that have actually benefited from European colonization, where they've expanded their range eastward following European colonization. They're a bit smaller than the common grackle. They're only like around 7 to 9 inches. He has a bright yellow eye, whereas she has a brown eye. He has a purplish sheen with a pretty short tail, and she's pretty plain brown. So if you want to try to identify her, she has the blackbird beak, and oftentimes you'll find them together in large groups. In general, blackbirds are another good example of a species that will eat a lot of insects in part of the season. They'll also eat grain and seeds right when you plant them. Brewer's blackbirds have been shown to help control weevil infestations. And another important fact about the blackbirds is that they can also pick up food pathogens from livestock. And in general, most birds are able to pick up food pathogens. We won't go too much into it, but trying to reduce the contact of blackbirds with livestock can help reduce that. And keeping those feeders really clean can also help protect the birds as well as the crops. And You can attract blackbirds by putting out feeders. They like the seeds, especially if they're on the ground. And if you want to try to promote nesting, a lot of species like red-winged blackbirds and yellow-headed blackbirds nest in wetlands, and generally they'll have the highest activity the closer they are to the nesting habitat in the fields. So if you want to try to have more blackbirds in the fields, planting those crops that you want them to be in closer to the wetland is good. And if you don't want them in the crop, planting it further away would be one way to try to reduce the contacts or increase them. Next are the introduced species. The first one is the European starling, and interestingly, the European starling was introduced into Central Park in the 1800s by Shakespeare enthusiasts who felt that all of the birds in Shakespeare's plays should be found in Central Park for Shakespeare in the Park. And they introduced them 4 times before they would start to take hold in the area. And since then, they spread throughout the entire country, where they're now considered a nuisance species, both for crop damage and for competing with native species for cavity nesting space. There's a breeding plumage and a non-breeding plumage, though the males and females look similar. And a good way to tell starlings apart from native species is that they have a yellow bill and pink legs, so very colorful beak and legs. And they're also a stocky bird with a pretty short tail. And starlings aren't closely related to native species. Starlings and mynas are in one family, and then the native blackbirds are in an entirely different family. And in the winter, they'll get nice spotting. If you want to try to tell the starlings from the natives, again, the leg and beak color are a really good way to do that. The natives have a black bill and black legs, and they generally have longer tails and are less stocky. And the voices are very different. The starlings is pretty scratchy, and they're mimics where they're able to learn the songs of other species and incorporate that into their own songs. Whereas the native blackbirds tend to have more simple vocalizations that are pretty fixed. They don't vary much across the region, and they generally have one song that they'll do over and over. Next is the house sparrow, which is similarly introduced from Europe and has since spread across the country. The male and the female are dimorphic. He is easy to tell from his black bib that you won't see that in the native species. He has a gray cap and a rufous color in his nape and back and a white belly. She lacks the bib. Her easiest feature is this bold tan eye stripe. And they also have really thick seed-eating bills, more like a finch than a sparrow. And the house sparrow, similarly, is not in the same family as the native sparrows. It's in the European sparrow family, which is separate from the North American sparrow family. And she has a buffy belly and a striped back. If you want to try to tell the house sparrow from the native sparrows, the size of the beak is a good cue. The natives have thinner beaks. They often have streaking on the belly, whereas the house sparrow will have just a buffy belly. The habitat is a good cue, where house sparrows are really urban specialists. They'll reach high populations in urban areas or in really agricultural areas, but you won't find them in natural areas, as opposed to the native sparrows are often in grasslands or forests. And the number of individuals that you see is also a good cue. House sparrows are very gregarious, as opposed to the native sparrows. During the summer, they're usually in pairs, though they form into mixed species flocks during migration in the winter. And the song is a really good cue. The house sparrow has very simple vocalizations that aren't usually described as a song. It's just sort of a repeating call note, as opposed to the native sparrows have very complex songs that they can learn from others. The next invasive is the rock pigeon. So this is the kind of basic urban pigeon that you find in really high densities in cities. He has a red eye, an iridescent green nape, and is a very large stocky dove. Our final invasive for the day is the Eurasian Collared-Dove. They were introduced from the Caribbean in the 90s, where they were kept as pets and got out, and since then they've spread across the entire country almost. Like their name implies, they have a black collar. They're a pretty large stocky dove with just kind of a buffy color throughout most of the body. When managing for invasive species, remember that natives are protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, so you can't harm them unless you get a permit. But invasives are not protected, so you can use lethal control. It's usually recommended by conservationists to monitor nest boxes and remove invasives so that the natives can instead use that space. And oftentimes the invasive species will nest in structures in areas that you don't want to. So here is a photo of a food wash station that a starling was nesting in the circled cavity area. And of course, this isn't good because then they can defecate on the table where the food is being washed. So a good way to try to keep them out of there is to put up netting. Next is native doves, which we'll only talk about one today, though if you're in the Southwest, you have many options, which is the mourning dove, which is found throughout the country. The mourning dove is often confused with the Eurasian collared-dove, but the important feature to look for is that the mourning doesn't have the black collar, and the mourning has wing spots. And the mourning is just a little bit more graceful looking of a dove. They have a pointed tail, whereas the Eurasian collared-dove has a flat tail. And the mourning has a pretty thin body as opposed to this large, stocky Eurasian collared-dove. And the voice is another good cue. The mourning dove we'll listen to first. There's a peewee in the background of that recording. So with the mourning dove, it kind of goes up and then down, and it sounds like they're mourning. As opposed to the Eurasian collared-dove is very rhythmic, and it's often confused with an owl, actually. So very repetitive, whoo-hoo, hoo, whoo-hoo, hoo. So our second to last group is the corvids, which I've only chosen a few, which was hard to narrow down. The first one is the blue jay, which is in the eastern portion of the country with some incidentals in the northwest. They have a blue crest and a black necklace with a plain white belly. In contrast, the Steller's jay, which is usually referred to by people on the West Coast as the blue jay, is more black. It has black on the crest, throat, and neck, and blue belly and wings. And usually Steller's jay are in more forested areas. Our last corvid comparison is the American crow and the common raven, which can be kind of difficult to tell apart. If you're in the portion of the range where they overlap, is the first cue. They've largely been extirpated from the Midwest, for example, due to clearing of forests, which they need for nesting. So the first good cue is the voice. The American crow is much more nasally, whereas the common raven's a bit deeper.
Let's see. You want me to try it? Yeah, it looks like it's not working that well. Okay, so here we go. So that's the crow. Okay, and here's the raven.
It's a bit deeper and more jarring. And both of them have a large range of vocalizations, but those are kind of the most common that you would hear. Another good cue is the size. The American crow is about 2/3 the size of a common raven. And these screenshots are from Cornell Lab of Ornithology that they use in their Merlin bird ID tool. So that's an excellent way to try to figure out what bird you're looking at, is to go into Merlin bird ID. So I jokingly say good luck at managing corvids. Corvids are extremely intelligent. There are a couple of good books that have come out recently. One's called Gift of the Crow, and another one is Genius of Birds, that kind of go into more detail about how smart corvids are. But because they're smart, that often means that you get problems. I work with a couple of growers who have problems with ravens coming in every morning before they can get their chicken eggs. The ravens come before the farmers get up, and then they go into the chicken coop and take the eggs. And some other people have complained about corvids pecking open drip line, which of course is very expensive, but the corvids know that there's water there in a dry environment. If you do want to attract them to your house, for example, and also crows and ravens are known to help control rodent populations, as well as some pest insects. But of course, things like jays can eat a lot of almonds or other fruit. So if you want to try to attract them to your house, for example, putting out tray feeders or leaving out peanuts or pet food is a good way to do that. And if you want to try to encourage nesting, leaving up hedges or forests can be a good way to encourage the nesting. And I've also heard a trick from a couple growers where they put up large, like 6-foot poles and then strung across fishing line over areas where the crows were coming in to eat the transplants. I don't even think they were eating them. I think they were just pulling them up to have fun. And so they put up the fishing line over the poles, and that helped them from coming in when they hit that. Then they didn't want to be in that area again. So our last group are the raptors, which I think are probably something people have been looking forward to. The first one is red-tailed hawk, which is one of the most common hawks in the world. And they have, like their name implies, a red tail, and they're dark above. If you're looking at them from below, one plumage morph has the brown belly band. There are a couple of plumage morphs, so we're just looking at the most common. They also have the pale underwing and dark wingtips. But as you're looking at cross-color morphs, the shape of the wings and tail are a good cue. Next is northern harrier. And talking about the wing shape cue, the northern harrier's wings are a lot thinner and their tail is a lot longer. And the best way to identify the harrier is that they have a white tail stripe. They also have a face that looks like an owl, and the reason for this is that they hunt for rodents using sound in the same way that owls do. And they're usually in wetlands or grasslands where they eat tons of rodents, and they're oftentimes in the pastures where they can help with that rodent control. Here's a photo of where a northern harrier was nesting on one of the farms that I worked with. And this farm uses a rotational pasture system where they have sheep that they rotate through their pastures. And so northern harrier started nesting here. So they left this area unmowed and ungrazed and allowed the harriers to nest. So generally, the more area you can give, the better for preventing predation. Ground nesting birds have really high predation rates. And not creating a trail to the nest is also important. You don't want to show predators where to find that nest. Our only owl today is the barn owl, though you'll also find things like great horned owls on the farm. The barn owl has a cinnamon body with a spotted white chest and a heart-shaped face. They will nest in nest boxes. Here are a couple examples of nest boxes and a picture of a just fledged chick. They're kind of helpless still when they first fledge, and they'll be relying on mom and dad for a while. They'll also nest in silos if you have that available. So our final bird of the day is the American kestrel. The American kestrel is pretty small, only about 12 inches at the most, and they're actually falcons rather than hawks. And they have a really small parrot-like bill. They're described as having a handlebar mustache. He is rusty above with the slate blue on the wings and face, whereas she's rusty all over with a gray crown. And a good behavioral cue is that they bob their tails when they're perched. So oftentimes you'll see them fly down and pick up a rodent and then fly back up to a power line where you can see them bobbing their tail. Kestrels have recently been shown to be extremely beneficial for cherry production through both direct consumption and scaring away of pest birds and rodents. And if you want to try to attract kestrels, installing nest boxes is a really good way to do that. They're going to be most effective at controlling pests when the chicks are in the nest and they're the most territorial. And if you want more information about installing a nest box, you can go to nestwatch.org. In conclusion, we've gone over 43 of the most common birds today, but the US has over 400 breeding birds, and throughout the year you can find over 700 birds, including incidentals that fly over from Europe in a storm or get here in some unusual way. And so we've also just gone over mostly the plumage patterns, but learning the general size and shape, the plumage, behaviors, vocalizations, and common habitats are good ways to advance your birding skills. And this often just comes from practice, so just keeping at it, going birding. It's a long learning process. I've been interested in birds for the last 8 years, I think, and I'm still learning. And in general, for farm management, birds generally play pretty complex roles on the farm. The same species can be really beneficial in one portion of the season, but not so beneficial in other portions of the season. So I think kind of keeping in mind your overall goals, are you interested in conservation? Are you interested in trying to maximize your crop production? Are you interested in pest control? And keeping those things in mind when making the bird management decisions can be important. If you want to continue learning birds, some additional resources, field guides, I like Sibley personally. There are a few apps that you can get on your phone if you don't want to carry around a book. And Cornell Lab of Ornithology offers Bird Academy courses, which there's one that's free, and then otherwise they cost money, which I haven't used, so I'm not necessarily recommending them, but that is available. If you want to learn bird song, I use the app Larkwire, although there are a few other song learning apps that are probably also helpful. If you want to just listen to a recording, you can go to ebird.org, their app, allaboutbirds.org, Macaulay Library from Cornell. In general, it's recommended to not play recordings where birds can hear them. That makes them think that there are intruders in their area and increases their stress. And if you want some more habitat management tips, nestwatch.org has information on promoting nesting. Yardmap.org has information on native plants that are helpful. And we had a webinar last year about how to use Merlin and Habitat Network if you want more information on using those tools. And we've published a few articles on eOrganic about identification, diet, and management of chickadees and warblers, swallows and swifts, and western bluebird, as well as an article on how to identify nests. So with that, I think we can move on to the questions.
All right, thank you, Olivia. I really learned a lot, and the slides are really an excellent resource with all those tips of the most common things that you can use to identify particular birds. So I'm definitely going to keep those as a reference, and we have those archived online already, and I put the link in the chat box. And if you want to find that more easily, you can just type in the title of this webinar in the future, and you'll find the recording on eXtension on an article page along with the slides. So I'll put the link to that in just a moment during the Q&A. So if you came on a little late and you have a question, you can just type it into the Q&A box on your screen, and we'll be reading them out loud until we run out of time. We have about half an hour or so. And if you don't see the Q&A box, there should be a black bar with some controls at the bottom of your screen. If you click on the Q&A one, that should open it up. So we did record the presentation, so if you want to go back and hear it again, you'll be able to find the recording in about a week on the eOrganic YouTube channel and on the link that I just put up in a minute. And we'll also be sending you a follow-up survey by email later today, so we would very much appreciate it if you could fill that out. So I'm going to start asking questions here. Let's see, I'll just randomly go through here. Let's see, is it okay to promote habitats for more than one raptor, or are they too territorial?
That's a good question. I think generally they could forage in the same area. I've definitely seen farms that have both red-tailed hawks and northern harriers, you know, kind of co-occurring. And raptors also have very large daily movement patterns. So like the farm would be a stop along their territory as opposed to, you know, their entire territory. So I think that you could probably try to promote multiple raptors, particularly adding a kestrel nest box and a raptor perch, for example. I think you could definitely promote multiple raptors at the same time. And another comment on that is that owls will forage at night as opposed to things like hawks will forage in the day. And so they wouldn't necessarily be in competition. They could help complement each other during different parts of the day.
Okay, let's see. Do you think that there's a correlation between birds on the farm and pollinator habitats?
For sure, for the hummingbirds, the hummingbirds are definitely not going to be in fields where there aren't any of those pollinator resources. So if you want to try to promote hummingbirds in particular, adding that pollinator habitat can be a good way to do that. And I think generally with the farms that I work with, people who integrate the pollinator habitat typically have smaller field sizes that they're breaking up with those pollinator patches. And anytime you get smaller fields, you'll get more birds in the fields. And things like sunflowers in particular will attract a lot of finches. So I think you can co-manage those objectives at the same time.
Okay. Are there any general ways to attract insect-eating birds versus fruit and crop-eating birds?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that that's a bit difficult to get one and not the other. We found that with the insectivorous birds, the number of insectivorous birds tends to increase as the habitat becomes more natural, as opposed to things like grain-eating birds tend to be like they don't have the same response to the degree of natural habitat. So integrating a lot of natural habitat can be a good way to promote insectivores. You will probably still get fruit eaters, but it could help shift away from that. And just promoting through nest boxes, a lot of these fruit eaters aren't nesting in nest boxes, opposed to the insectivores, for the most part, really need those.
Okay. Which of the birds that you mentioned are endangered species? The person here is thinking of the meadowlark, and are there other endangered species which people might see on the farm?
Yeah, there definitely are quite a few endangered species, particularly if you're going from the federal level to the state level. For example, the lesser goldfinch is endangered in the state of Washington. So you definitely can get endangered or threatened species. I think in the work that I've done in California, Oregon, and Washington, about 30 of the species we've observed are endangered at the state level. And Western bluebirds are endangered in portions at the state level as well. So you definitely can promote species that are declining. And grassland species tend to be one of the most threatened groups. So anytime you can promote grassland species, that's a good conservation action.
Okay. So do you have any other thoughts on leaving no-mow zones for bird and pollinator habitats and promoting biodiversity?
I guess that's kind of open-ended. So please reply with another question if I don't answer the question that you had in mind. I, for my master's degree, was specifically working with conservation reserve programs. So it's kind of a dear topic to me. And I think leaving the no-mow zones is very beneficial for a very vulnerable group of birds that are declining rapidly throughout the country. So anytime you can do that, I think it's a really good action that also has the benefit of reducing erosion and other non-bird environmental benefits.
Okay, I just want to make one more plug. If you have any questions, don't be shy and feel free to type them in because we don't have a whole lot and we have quite a bit of time left. So this is a great opportunity to have Olivia answer your question, or at least attempt to. And yeah, so let's see. I do see one more here. So do you have any other thoughts about birds and insect pest control on the farm?
Yeah, I guess one thought that's kind of a caveat is we've done some work looking at the consumption of both pest and beneficial insects. And our work and some work out of Europe have shown that birds, of course, will also eat natural enemies. And they tend to do so more at the end of the season. So in the beginning of the season, when they have really high insect consumption for their chicks, they really like caterpillars and things that have really high protein content and fat content. And as the natural enemies begin to establish, they will also eat the natural enemies. So I guess that would be one additional thought, is that at the end of the season, they might primarily be eating natural enemies. But in general, birds, when people have looked at net impact on crop yields, they tend to be pretty beneficial, at least in the early part of the season, and they can reduce the natural enemy populations towards the end.
Going back to no-mow zones, should they be rotated on a yearly basis, or how often would you recommend that?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not an expert on like the no-mow zones in particular. I know with conservation reserve program, it's generally recommended to manage every 5 years or so during the mid-contract management. And with the birds, the more mature the stand, the more beneficial that's going to be. It'll start to have better food resources. And I guess my general initial thought would be that leaving it in the same area might be beneficial. Birds tend to have, can't think of quite the right word, but they like to be kind of in the same spot year after year. So a lot of birds will migrate and come back to exactly the same location. So if you think that it's a spot that is working really well for the birds, then my inclination would be to say not to rotate it. But also, some places are easier for birds to reach than others. So kind of thinking of a place that optimizes the bird's ability to get there would also be good to think about when planning where you want that grass patch.
Yeah, I've noticed on my property, Western bluebirds come back to exactly the same spot every single year, and they've multiplied, which is really exciting. And, I'm not really consciously doing anything, but it is pretty grassy, and I don't take excellent care of it. So we don't mow too frequently. Okay, so here's someone who has struggled a lot with starlings on their blueberries. They've tried battery-powered recordings that play predator bird sounds and birds in distress. What are your thoughts on this approach? Have you heard any other approaches for keeping birds out of a field like that? And just to clarify, these birds seem to get used to each approach that they try after a week or so.
Yeah, that sounds like what I generally hear from growers, that, it might work for a few days and then starlings are incredibly smart. So they'll figure out that, that's not really a threat. I saw an article recently that was looking at use of laser beams to keep birds out of blueberries, and they found that it was pretty comparable to netting. I don't think that starlings were extremely common on their sites, but that might be something to look into, the laser beams to scare them away. And kestrels might be another good way to try to keep them out of there, promoting the small bird hunting raptors that could try to scare them away. But I think starlings and blueberries are a big problem that people need to keep looking for tools to try to prevent them from, damaging so much crop.
Okay. Is there a way to discourage birds from perching on garden structures like tomato cages and defecating on fruit and plants without totally keeping them away and losing the benefits of their insect control?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting problem where anytime you have kind of like a perching structure, the birds want to be on that perching structure, whether that's like a sprinkler head or a cage around a plant. A lot of times people recommend putting spikes up. Those can harm birds. If they come in and land wrong, they can get spiked on the spikes. That is one way that you could potentially try to keep them off of there. And I think one general technique that might be beneficial is just like with the swallows, trying to provide a space that you do want them, so you can install perches throughout the field that aren't right above the fruit themselves, but that might draw them away to a more appropriate area.
Okay. Which birds could be encouraged for reducing mosquitoes?
Oh, that's a good question. Western bluebirds actually, in one of the studies, they found that over half of their diet was mosquitoes. So Western bluebirds are a good one. And swallows can also eat a lot of mosquitoes. So anything that is catching insects in the air, generally. Flycatchers, I would expect to be pretty good. People in California have the benefit of black phoebes, which are probably pretty beneficial.
Okay. Which type of raptor is ideal for rodent control in blueberries?
I think probably kestrels would be your best bet. A lot of the raptors, like harriers, prefer a grassy open area, but kestrels like to be in orchards or blueberries, things like that. So having the kestrel box would be a good idea. Cooper's hawks could probably be beneficial. Cooper's hawks are usually just found in forested areas, so you might not be able to get them if you're in a more agricultural or urban area.
Okay, let's see. Let me just get this question here. How important is it to have an open source of water on your farm for birds? And how far would they travel for water? In other words, what kind of distance radius do we need to make sure there's a good water source during the summer drought? These people are in the Pacific Northwest, with most of the birds listed on this presentation present.
I haven't seen too many studies that specifically look at providing water sources. Water sources are definitely important for things like tree swallows that prefer to nest over water. I think none of the farms that I work with really provide a specific water habitat. So I think a lot of times birds can get water from the food that they eat. And I guess a caveat to the water source is to make sure that you're changing it frequently so that they don't get any of the, so it doesn't get too much fecal contamination. So I guess I don't have a necessarily an answer to the question of how far apart. I think providing water can definitely be very beneficial for things like swallows or blackbirds. And then the caveat just to make sure that you're cleaning it regularly if it's like a bird bath or something like that.
Somebody asked whether if we change birds' habit, does it stress them out?
If you change the bird's habitat?
Yeah.
Yes, I think if you make any type of modifications, you'll probably induce stress in the birds. Trying to minimize the change in habitat would probably be best for trying to reduce those stress levels. But of course, you know, the farming operations are the top priority. So, you know, do what you have to do and then try to minimize the stress by doing things either at the end of the nesting season or very early in the spring would generally be my recommendation.
Okay. Are migratory snow geese protected?
That's a good question. So I think yes. I feel pretty positive. Yes, Canada geese are definitely protected. Some birds, like quail, are not protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, but they are protected by state regulations. So non-migratory resident species like game birds will be protected at the state level, but not federal. But I'm pretty sure that snow geese would fall under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act.
Okay. Are there any birds that help reduce tick populations?
You know, I haven't seen any research on consumption of ticks. I know that birds themselves can get ticks, and the concern there is that because they move across long distances, that has the potential to bring ticks into new areas that could have bacteria. But I'm not sure that anyone has looked at if they're able to behaviorally remove the ticks and reduce the populations.
Okay. We're nearing the end here of our questions. I don't see too many more in the queue, so I do have one about monarch butterflies. I don't know if you could help this person, but this person was wondering if he should introduce milkweed for monarchs or convert to a short grass diverse native prairie. So, I mean, that's kind of off the subject here, but perhaps you have some thoughts about that.
Yeah, my caveat is that I don't know very much about monarchs, so take this as a non-expert advice. My inclination would be that doing the prairie might be more beneficial if you could plant a stand that includes the milkweed in particular, and that way you can benefit species beyond the monarch, like birds that want to also use that habitat. It seems like that might have broader reaching benefits.
Okay, well, I think that was it for the questions. So thanks everyone for contributing all those questions. And thank you very much, Olivia, for answering them. And we hope that everyone here can join us for all of our other upcoming webinars in our webinar series this season. I know tomorrow we have one on crop insurance on organic farms, and you can find all of our webinars by just typing webinars by eOrganic into a search engine. So thanks again, Olivia, and thanks to everyone for joining us.